Every case I cover on this podcast is a tragedy. No matter the circumstance, someone's loved one has been murdered or gone missing, and that family is still awaiting answers. Some cases, it can feel like it's all but solved. There's just one key component missing or something getting in the way. Others, it can feel like there is absolutely nothing to go on, or, in contrast, what feels like a million different possibilities. This case is really none of those, and if I had to categorize it, it's one that makes you say, how could this possibly happen? Logistically and feasibly, how are these the circumstances? And how are we here without answers nearly 55 years later? On a spring weekend in 1970, a group of Boy Scouts went camping on a church property and spent the weekend having fun and doing typical outdoor activities. But on the morning they were to leave, the Scouts would wake up to find one of their own dead in his sleeping bag. Despite 24 people being at the campsite and everyone sleeping within feet of each other, nobody claims to have seen or heard a single thing. Today, I'll share with you what leads were tracked down, who some of the suspects were, and where the case stands today. I'll also discuss some of the disturbing information and controversy that has surfaced relating to sexual abuse in Boy Scouts over recent years. As a content warning, this episode will discuss the murder of a child as well as sexual abuse of minors. In both scenarios, I'll only be sharing details necessary to understand the case or related topics, but please take care when listening. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Terrence Bowers, Jr. Terrence Bowers Jr., who liked to go by Terry, was born on November 23, 1958. His parents were Terrence Sr. and Mary, and he was the second born. He was joined by older sister Maureen and younger siblings Colleen, Suzanne, Christopher, and John Andrew. The family resided in the working-class neighborhood of Upper Darby Township in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. Upper Darby is a large area. In fact, population-wise, it comes in number 6, right after the ones you're probably more familiar with hearing: Philadelphia, Allentown, Pittsburgh, Reading, and Erie. Terry was a sweet boy with sandy hair and a big smile. According to an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, he was your typical boy. He played Little League baseball, kept a pet snake in a box on his front porch, and earned $2 a day helping his grandmother at their family gas station. In 1970, he was a 6th grader in Catholic school at Blessed Virgin Mary School in Darby, and that school had an affiliated Boy Scout troop, Troop 275, that Terry was part of. On Friday, April 24th, Terry packed up to join his troop on a camping trip. He was really excited. He had just joined the troop a year prior, and he soaked in everything that came along with being a Boy Scout. Terry, alongside approximately 20 other campers and a handful of scout leaders, were going to be traveling 30 miles north to camp on land owned by another Catholic church. The trip was sponsored by the Catholic War Veterans Group. Just a quick side note, I know in Catholicism that the saint is pronounced Saint Basil, and churches are often called Saint Basil. And in this case, I even tried to find a video made by the church or someone talking about the church to clarify the pronunciation for this podcast. But because I couldn't, I'm just going to roll with it. So if you're local and you know the right pronunciation, feel free to correct me. But I'm going to go with Saint Basil the Great. So the church property they were camping on was the Saint Basil the Great Catholic Church around Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. This church is in a relatively suburban area. My understanding is if you keep driving further, it does get a little bit more isolated, but not in this particular area. There's some main streets and things all around it, but the church itself had acreage. The church is located at 2330 Kimberton Road. I'm going to have a map of this area with an overhead view from Google Maps on our Instagram at SimplerTime Crime Pod. So Kimberton Road is where you access the road into the church, and then the church sits way back off the road. Behind the church is a wooded area of 18 acres and a hillside and this open clearing area, which is where they would have had their tents and actually been staying. And that backs up to Pike Springs Road, which is also known as Route 113. And so that's the area that the scouts camped in. The troop arrived Friday evening, and the plan was to camp for 2 overnights. They're going to have some fun and then depart at 1 p.m. on Sunday. When it came to the sleeping arrangements, everyone had sleeping bags, but some boys chose to sleep in the tents while others preferred to sleep in the open in their sleeping bags by the fire. Some of the boys would start out in the open, and then they would get too cold and crawl into the tents at some point overnight. There isn't any source material that specifies where the adults slept, but since one of the articles speaks to just a handful of the boys sleeping around the fire, my conclusion was that the scout leaders slept in tents. So Friday night, this went off without any issues, and all day Saturday, the boys had a blast. During the day, they stayed active, being in and out of the woods, they played football, they played field hockey, and then that evening, they built another fire and stayed up talking and telling stories. Terry was one of the boys who liked sleeping around the fire, out in the open. Now, no matter where the boys slept, everyone was in very close proximity of each other. We're talking feet of each other. The field area the boys were camping in was about 200 yards from the church building on the edge of the woods and not far within a couple hundred yards of Route 113 as well. As scout leaders and fellow scouts headed off to bed, a handful of boys decided to stay up a little longer. Friends last reported seeing Terry around the campfire at approximately 2:30 a.m., and then he went to bed. I want to forewarn you, I'm going to do my best with what material is out there, but in these next parts, there are discrepancies from different news sources who reported on the case at the time. I'm going to share the different variations with you, as well as some of the questions that came up for me as I found those. At approximately 7:30 a.m., a friend of Terry's went to wake the boy up. He had moved a bit away from the fire, closer to a nearby tent, but not in it. As the boy approached, he noticed something disturbing. Terry wasn't moving, and there was blood all around his sleeping bag pooled. The boy quickly summoned help from the adults, who then called the authorities. Terry Bowers Jr. had been stabbed multiple times while asleep in his sleeping bag. One and only one source states that he was alive when he was found and then later died at the hospital. Every other source describes him as dead when he is found, and that's substantiated by the time of death, which I'll get into more in a minute. The scene was very difficult to control. Parents arrived to the scene before authorities did, and his body had been moved, not in a nefarious way, but just because they were trying to see if he was alive and if they could help him. There were nearly 24 Boy Scouts who just found out their friend had been murdered in the middle of the night. It was predictably chaotic. And then the family of Terry Bowers had to hear the news. The second born in the family, the oldest boy, had gone off to have a weekend of fun in one of the safest ways possible, only to be violently murdered as he slept. When Terry was found, it was reported that he was face down with 3/4 of his body outside of the sleeping bag, while the rest of his body was still tucked into it. What he was wearing was another mixture of reports. Some sources said he had on a t-shirt with a polo shirt on over it and nothing on from the waist down, whereas other sources refer to him having pajamas on. The pajamas obviously make more sense and were more widely reported on, but there are clearly some implications that come along with the first description, And the most recent article on the case does go back to saying he had nothing on from the waist down. So I wanted to mention both. Terry had been stabbed 4 times, 3 times to the back, and 1 time through his right arm into his chest. He was stabbed through his sleeping bag. The time of death was established to be around 6:30 a.m., though various reports will give a window as early as 4 a.m., and his body was found at 7:30. Police secured the scene and asked all the boys and troop leaders if they had seen or heard anything. Again, they would have been feet away from him, but nobody said they heard or saw a single thing or clue. There was no screaming, nobody just lurking around the campsite, nothing like that. Everyone said they saw him around the campfire, they went to bed, and they woke up and found him. Now, I don't know about you, but when I've gone camping, I'm up with the birds. It's hard to sleep in outdoors. And I know these are tweens who stayed up late, but I have a hard time imagining that not a single person would have been stirring at 6:30 in the morning. So if it's true that nobody saw anything, I feel like the crime had to have occurred earlier and that the 1970s time of death estimate was just off. Boy Scouts being Boy Scouts, almost all the kids had little hunting knives on them, so police confiscated and bagged all for evidence and testing. But right off the bat, none of these did look like the murder weapon. The examination of the body revealed that the knife used would have been a small knife with a 4.5-inch blade, sharpened on one side, and none of the knives of the boys or the leaders fit that description, but of course they were still going to examine them forensically. But with that in mind, investigators wanted to try to scour the woods and the surrounding field for any evidence, especially the murder weapon. Another important key detail is that there were puncture marks in Terry's sleeping bag, as police reported to the press that he had been stabbed through the sleeping bag. So this makes me wonder if he was stabbed, if he tried to crawl out but was too badly injured to get help. The fact that he was face down and partially out of his sleeping bag could give way to that scenario. The day after the murder, police searched the woods with metal detectors, looking for the murder weapon. They had people looking for any signs of evidence without any luck anywhere, not in the field, the woods, anywhere around the property. On Tuesday, more than 1,500 people showed up to the viewing for Terry Bowers. The typically stoic nuns from his school wept alongside his classmates. The question that most permeated the room was simply, why? Terry was well liked and well behaved. When police interviewed the scout leaders and fellow scouts, they all said everyone was getting along that weekend and having fun. There was no bullying or arguments or anything like that. Terry Bowers Jr. was laid to rest at St. Peter and Paul Cemetery. The community felt like their innocence was just shattered. How could an 11-year-old boy be murdered in his sleep at Boy Scout camp? It was just unheard of. And that was just the tip of the questions. People wondered, had truly nobody seen anything? Was it someone from church? Was it a fellow scout or a leader? William Potts, the commissioner of the local Boy Scout district at the time, said, quote, "There was complete friendship among the boys and leaders. We believe someone slipped into the camp and did it," end quote. That scenario really is the stuff of nightmares. I was a Girl Scout who went on camping trips, and those are the types of stories we would tell around the campfire to scare each other, but we never anticipated they could actually be real. Investigators spent early Sunday mornings around the church property on Route 113, asking motorists and those who were nearby if they had seen anything odd on the morning of the murder. The thought was, if there were regular people who drove around the area on Sunday mornings, maybe to go to work, they may have some luck. If you listen to my earlier episodes on Alicia Showalter Reynolds and the Route 29 stalker, this was a police strategy in that case too. But unlike in Alicia's case, it didn't really help. Despite the traumatic event and concern for public safety, both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts in the area said they did not plan to alter their camping routines whatsoever. There's some kind of caveat for the Girl Scout camps because they typically were better monitored by law enforcement and park rangers. But Frank Fultz, the executive director of the Boy Scouts of America at Valley Forge at the time, was quoted as saying, "This incident is well behind us and our programs are going ahead full speed." I can understand the sentiment behind not living in fear and changing lives forever, but these are children's lives we're talking about. And I don't know about you, but if I'm a parent and my kid is supposed to be going to scout camp that summer, Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts, I'm going to want there to be some sort of assurance that my child is safe and to know how you've upped your security, especially when there's no one caught for this crime. And this is where I go on to say the whole theme of my podcast, A Simpler Time, True Crime, this just simply wouldn't fly nowadays. You could not have something like this occur and then just say, we're going to carry on as usual, not changing plans, nothing. If I was a scout leader and something like this happened and I was planning on taking children back out into the wilderness to camp, I would have to say, this is what we're doing. We're keeping this amount of people on standby, and these are all the people who are going to be supervising, and we're going to sleep in shifts and all of those types of things. So just an example. By June 19th, police provided an update to the public on the investigation because, well, the public was growing restless. And the update was kind of a mixed bag. I'll start with the not as great. So they had a dedicated 6-man state police task force dedicated to the case, but they didn't have any suspects identified, so not a great win there. Reporters and news outlets asked about the potential of a sexual assault, and the investigators declined to comment at the time. Just for clarity, I'm going to jump ahead and say that there was an article published in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 2012, and that does state that the autopsy showed no signs of sexual trauma. So they didn't comment on it at the time, which just fueled speculation, but it doesn't seem to be a sexually motivated crime, at least it wasn't carried out. That's where the evidence points. Another question that was asked that police refused to comment on was if the scout leaders had been drinking or intoxicated. Sergeant James Wenner said that they had interviewed 250 people at that point, and that it had produced a witness sighting. A motorist had come forward to say that they had seen 2 young white men in their late teens or early 20s walking away from the campsite area at around 6:30 that Sunday morning towards a dark-colored car parked along Route 113. Wenner pled for anybody who may have seen something similar or who may have seen these people to come forward. Unfortunately, they didn't get a good description of the men or the vehicles, which it's a bit of a needle in a haystack with that situation then. So on the downside, they don't have any suspects, but on the upside, they did have a witness statement now. Wenner also said they had searched the field 3 times over with metal detectors and couldn't find any trace of the murder weapon. They had also drained a nearby pond with no signs of evidence or the murder weapon. By June, police had also begun polygraphing the boys and Boy Scout leaders from the camping trip. The process was long and tedious. There was only one polygraph machine and only a couple of people trained on how to do the polygraph tests and read them. At this point, the boys had all been interviewed multiple times since the incident just to see if they had been a bit removed from the events, if they could remember anything. They thought maybe, that morning when they first were asking them questions, they were so traumatized and in shock that maybe if they gave them space and time to digest, they would remember new things. But all of them stuck to their story that they had been sleeping when this occurred and that they didn't hear anything. But now that it was time for polygraphs, all the minors had to have their parents' consent. And it was given freely, so these adults didn't seem like they were trying to cover anything up. They willingly allowed their children to do these, and the children stuck to their stories yet again. The adults took them too. From what was released, all passed their polygraph exams, and all the physical evidence collected, including the knives, had no evidence connected to anything with the crime. This goes for all the boys' knives and the leaders' knives. There was no blood or fibers or anything under the microscope that would tie back to Terry Bowers' homicide. And they cross-referenced all the stories, which again, it's not like they all had these various different places they had wandered off to. They just all said they were sleeping, and they all spoke for each other and said, oh yeah, we were all sleeping. By July of 1970, Members of the Valley Forge Council of the Boy Scouts of America donated their own personal funds towards a $5,000 reward for information that led to the arrest and conviction of the murderer. But that seemed to do very little. By December 3rd, nearly 7 months out from the crime, police said the impact of the reward offering had been negligible. They hadn't received any new tips in 2 months, and before that, there had only been a couple. And this case would only grow more cold over the years. That was until 7 years later when something similar happened in another part of the country. Thank you again for listening this week. I've been getting over a bout of COVID, and I know I still sound so stuffy and annoying, so thank you for your understanding and patience as you listen. I'm working on expanding the show, and word of mouth helps me so much. I also love any of the reviews you guys leave. I read all of them. And I know when I'm considering a new podcast, I read what people are saying about it first. So it really does go a long way. I welcome you to follow and interact with the podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. You can also send me case suggestions to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Thank you, and back to the episode. In June of 1977, 3 young girls aged 8, 9, and 10 were camping with their Girl Scout troop outside of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma at Camp Scott. They were all staying in tent number 7, the tent furthest from the camp counselors and partially obscured by the showers. At around 6 a.m. on June 13th, a camp counselor on her way to the shower saw a girl's body in her sleeping bag in a wooded area just outside of the tent area. Over time, it was discovered that all 3 girls from tent number 7 were missing, and as counselors began searching, they discovered that the girls from tent number 7 had all been murdered. 2 bodies were inside a sleeping bag, one crumpled toward the bottom of the bag, and one body was still visible on the outside. They had been left on a trail leading to the showers about 150 yards from their tent. Subsequent testing showed that they had been bludgeoned and strangled, and all 3 girls had been raped. Because of this being another homicide at a scout camp within the same decade, investigators met with authorities in Oklahoma to compare the cases, and what they found was that beyond the scout overlap, there wasn't much in common. The Oklahoma case had multiple female victims, whose tent area was a bit isolated, and they were all sexually assaulted, bludgeoned, and strangled. Terry Bowers was the lone victim, and he was stabbed through his sleeping bag and not sexually assaulted. So as horrific as the case was, police in Pennsylvania had to step aside and table any potential connection. DNA evidence in the Oklahoma case strongly points towards a man who was an escaped felon at the time and who was thought to be living out in those woods. Because it's just a partial DNA sample, they can't say with certainty, but investigators are almost certain themselves that it was him. He died in prison decades ago. Even though it was determined that the 2 cases were not connected, this did shake up Terry's case again, and he did get some news coverage, and police provided some updates. They had assigned 2 new detectives full-time to Terry's case. Sergeant James Wenner shared that back in 1972, they had raided the apartment of a 25-year-old employee of an adult bookstore. In his apartment, they found crude images and sexual material relating to male minors. Among all of his belongings were laminated newspaper clippings about Terry's case. But outside of that, they weren't able to connect him to the crime at all. Wenner shared that even after all these years, they were still puzzled by the motive of this crime. Nobody could figure out why. After this update, the case stayed cold again for a while until 1983, when an inmate came forward with information. He was a client of John Duffy, a well-known criminal defense attorney in the area and Terry's second cousin. This inmate claimed that he was present when a man who confessed to him that he had killed Terry was burning clothes the morning after the murder, and the clothes had blood all over them. another client of John Duffy gave a statement to the Chester County District Attorney's Office naming the same man, who has never been named publicly. For whatever reason, nothing has ever come of that. In 1991, Terry's mother, Mary, did a rare interview with local newspapers. She said that at first, she was stuck, not knowing how to proceed. In her interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer, she said, quote, "For years I was dormant, afraid to do anything. All I wanted was for my children to be healthy and to be left alone. Now I want to find out all I can." That would all be understandable given the circumstances, and I haven't even told you this yet, but Mary was a widow at this point. Terrence Sr. died in 1978 in his late 40s of a massive heart attack. Mary and the family knew in their hearts that the death of his oldest boy had aged him and put incredible stress on him and his heart. And though Mary was hanging in there, her son's death had broken and tormented her. Finding new resolve, Mary began writing letters to TV programs like Unsolved Mysteries, hoping to get her son's case featured. Over the years, she had thought about consulting with psychics and private detectives, anything that could help find answers for her. In this 1991 article, she revealed a theory that had resonated to her. A boyhood friend of Terry's, who looked an awful lot like him, reached out to her in 1987. He told her that as a boy, he had been molested by an Upper Darby man. This person said that he, the boy, was supposed to go on the same Boy Scout campout, but had to back out last minute. He felt that his sexual abuser had gone to the camp and killed Terry in a case of mistaken identity. Police don't put much into this theory. It would be quite a risky approach to silence someone about abuse by going to this camp where you could very visibly be caught. And this little boy, who was now in his early 30s, had a history of severe mental illness and drug abuse, and he had been hospitalized many times. Mary understood that it seemed far-fetched, but thought that maybe his mental illness and drug use was secondary to the trauma and that he was holding secrets that had burdened him over the years, and that maybe he was telling the truth. After Mary's interview, Terry's case went quiet from the media cycle again. Those local never forgot, but no new leads emerged. Year after year of solemn anniversaries, there was just nothing. Then, a wide-scale investigation of the Boy Scouts of America organization revealed a new suspect and new possible motives. If you live in the United States, you may have a good understanding and knowledge base of this next part, but because the Boy Scouts of America piece is more centered to the United States and I have some international listeners, I'll give a brief timeline of how this shook out. In the early 2000s, a large-scale investigation into systemic sexual abuse and its cover-up by the Catholic Church became a hot topic of conversation, and the Catholic Church really had to operate with a new level of transparency. It was revealed that for decades, children had been abused by Catholic priests and faith leaders, and that in large part the Catholic Church had covered it up. There were lawsuits as well as published documents and transparency about who these men were. Grown men stepped up years later and bravely shared their stories about abuse they suffered at the hands of men they trusted. There was a lot of new requirements of the Catholic Church about how to handle these situations, and if they're reported, what you have to do and what level of transparency is required, and written preventative measures. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's led to large-scale reform in the church. This got the ball rolling into looking at other organizations that might have vulnerability like this, where young children, particularly young boys, were left unsupervised with men, or where there may be a power dynamic at play. And in the United States, a pattern emerged around similar abuse happening in Boy Scouts of America. In 2012, a court case out of Oregon ruled that the Boy Scouts of America organization had to release what they called their, quote, perversion files. What was found was that from around 1965 to 1985, the Boy Scouts of America kept confidential files on who they suspected might be pedophiles and thus tried to bar them from having further access to positions in Boy Scouts in the future. Sometimes it went as simple as this. A person would be reported in the local paper for some sort of arrest or sexual misconduct, and someone affiliated with Boy Scouts would send that newspaper clipping in along with the confidential cover sheet filled out, sort of like a report, and they would use this to keep what was kind of like their own miniature sex offender registry, so that if that person tried to apply for a Boy Scout leadership or volunteer position, they would be denied. That was the best case scenario. What the files revealed, though, was dark and disturbing. In it were over 1,400 names from across the United States. According to a piece by NPR, they would show how some volunteers would be booted by the organization, and then someone would quietly sneak them back in, and then they'd get banned again because they would reoffend, and parents would come forward with the sexual abuse of their sons. Reporting in the Los Angeles Times shows Scouts, quote, failed to report hundreds of alleged child molesters to police and often hid the allegations from parents and the public, end quote. According to the Hurley Law Timeline article on the piece, the revelation into the Boy Scouts of America organization revealed 4 key takeaways. Number 1, first, there was a culture of silence, and that's one of the main reasons why the Boy Scouts of America was able to perpetuate the cycle of abuse for so long. Reports indicate that many victims were discouraged or even threatened into remaining silent about their experiences, fearing retaliation or disbelief from their peers and superiors. This created an environment where predators could exploit vulnerable children without fear of consequences. 2 was that there was a lack of accountability. Reports showed that misconduct was often mishandled or ignored by troop leaders, district officials, and even national headquarters. 3 was a failure to implement safeguards, mainly because they failed to adequately screen and train adult volunteers, which created opportunities for individuals with nefarious intentions to easily gain access to children. And 4 was the cultural clout and reputation. The Boy Scouts of America had this long-standing cultural clout and reputation. They were well known as being safe, and so families trusted that they could send their children to this organization and trust the Boy Scouts of America implicitly. So it was difficult for survivors to come forward and challenge that status quo. So you might be saying, Megan, I get that this case has intersection with the Catholic Church and Boy Scouts, but you already said Terry wasn't sexually assaulted, so what's the connection? Well, there's a couple. You see, the release of these perversion files caused people naturally to go through and see who had been a part of this, who lived in their area. And those who lived in this area of Pennsylvania were shocked when they came across one name. In it was the name Lawrence Wakely. Lawrence had lived in Phoenixville, just a couple of miles away from the crime scene. In his file with the Boy Scouts, there is an article linking to 2 rapes he was charged with in 1971. And within this file is a bombshell. There is evidence that Wakely confessed to killing Terry Bowers the year prior. How it went down was this. Lawrence Wakely was arrested in 1971 for the abduction and rape of 2 girls. He had 2 different charges and sentences for the 2 crimes. One for a March 28, 1971 incident involving a 15-year-old girl. In that case, he was found guilty of rape, assault and battery, corrupting the morals of children, assault with intent to ravish, and assault with intent to kill. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. For the second case, an April 7th attack on a 14-year-old girl, he was found guilty of rape, assault, and battery, corrupting the morals of children, and assault with the intent to ravish. He was also sentenced to an additional 5 to 15 years to be served at the expiration of the first sentence. While in custody, he confessed to Sergeant James Wenner that he had murdered Terry Bowers. He said that at age 20, he had been kicked out of the troops without reason and that it angered him. And so, when he saw the boys camping, he decided to kill a boy as his revenge. Sergeant Wenner, investigating this case at the time, had wanted to verify that he ever was a Boy Scout, so he had reached out to the local organization, and they had documented this via written correspondence and made a confidential file for Wakely so that he could never get a volunteer or paid position in Boy Scouts in the future. I'm going to put a link for his perversion file in the show notes, but it does confirm that he confessed and that the Boy Scouts had responded to Wenner with the dates of when he was in Scouts and what troops he had belonged to and when. It does not give any information on his dismissal from Scouts or any reason why that would have happened, if it actually did. Wenner was long retired when this information came back out to the surface, but he brushed it aside when questioned about it. He said he recalls interviewing someone matching this description, but that Wakely was mentally unstable and unreliable. He said that he couldn't get key details out of the crime, so things that only the killer would know, Wakely didn't know. And then he polygraphed him based on his alleged story, and he failed. So at that point, police just set him aside, and he wasn't considered a viable suspect anymore. Now, on the surface, that motive and acting out that crime sounds absurd, but in actuality, it happened another time. In Montana in 1968, a man named David Meyerhofer was angered for being dismissed from his volunteer Boy Scout leader position. As revenge, he snuck into a large Boy Scout camping weekend with over 200 boys there. He opened up a tent and randomly stabbed a 12-year-old boy to death. This boy had a tent mate who didn't wake up and didn't hear anything. Meyerhofer got away with it at the time for over a decade until he ended up being arrested for kidnapping a 7-year-old girl out of her tent while she was camping with her family, and he murdered her. Now, Wakely, in theory, should have served anywhere from 10 to 30 years in prison following his 1971 conviction, but he clearly was on the lighter end of that because he went back to jail for kidnapping and aggravated assault in 1991. If Wakely was involved in Terry Bauer's murder, we can't ask him anymore because he died on New Year's Day in 2021. Since the Wakely revelation, there hasn't been much more reporting on the case. In 2017, his siblings, along with the Boy Scouts of America, put up a combined $51,000 reward for information on the case. In April of 2024, a Facebook page for a media company called Stage 3 Productions dropped a teaser trailer for a documentary they said they would be putting out about the case. I haven't seen anything further, but I look forward to watching it when it's released. Before I wrap up, I know this case feels like it's had so much information and no information at the same time, so let's go through the possible suspects and scenarios one more time. Number 1, there's the possibility that the car and the 2 young white men seen walking back towards this dark car on Route 113 that the passing motorist identified, there's the possibility that's related. If it is, and that's a viable sighting and not someone just looking to give a fake tip, then I think there's a strong possibility that those people were at the very least witnesses to something. I can't imagine why they would otherwise need to be out in that field in the middle of the night. If they were involved, the 2-person scenario could explain why nobody heard Terry scream. If one person put their hand over his mouth while the other stabbed him, I don't know, maybe. I'm just trying to picture, and it does seem like it could maybe play out that way. But what was their motive? Why a random Boy Scout? And if not random, why Terry? Number 2 is the possibility of Lawrence Wakely. Did he truly act impulsively on his anger about being kicked out of Boy Scouts? Was the lie detector test that indicated he was lying during his confession just faulty? Maybe. Many still think Wakely was a very viable suspect because of his criminal history and where he lived in proximity to the crime scene. Number 3, was it the man that the prison informants said? We know that prison informants can be unreliable, but 2 different ones mentioned this unnamed man. Police have never said why they felt this was credible or not credible, or why nothing ever came of it. So that one we just sort of have to put a pin in, but consider. Number 4, was there any connection to this bookstore owner who had the laminated pictures, or was this guy just weird but not a killer? Number 5, is there any plausibility to the man who said it was mistaken identity? That's obviously the one that his mom latched onto a little bit, but nobody else seems to give it too much weight. Number 6, and this is one I haven't mentioned, did Terry see something he shouldn't have and then was silenced? Now that we know the sex abuse that was happening within Boy Scouts, was he a witness to something? And I'll even add another layer to this. If he was found without his pants on, as some reports indicate, was it an attempted sexual assault or sexual advances that went wrong and then ended up in someone trying to silence him? And that leads me to number 7, and it's the one that people always come back to. Was it a fellow scout mate or leader? Are people within the group covering for one another? Occam's razor would say that somebody present that night was a lot more likely to have conducted this than some outsider. The only thing that truly cleared them at the time was their own singular and group attestations and alibis about sleeping and their polygraphs, which aren't always reliable. But at the same time, this is a long time to keep a secret in that size of a group, and no evidence was ever found that tied anybody to the crime, which just seems like it would have been a really fast cover-up. Regardless of which of the above scenarios occurred, or if it was a scenario I didn't mention, I find it hard to believe that nobody knows anything. His sister Maureen agrees. She said in an interview, quote, "I just feel that there's got to be somebody out there who knows something. How does something so heinous go unsolved for so long?" Maureen also definitely considers the possibility of the sex scandals amongst Boy Scouts and within the Philadelphia Archdiocese, and that they could play a role. She said, quote, "Given all the things that have come forward with the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, we don't know." In 2010, his younger sister Suzanne wrote on a town message board, quote, "To all of you who remember Terry Bowers and pray for our family, thank you. Mom Bowers is still tormented daily. Funny how after all these years, the detectives have not come to any conclusions. Fishy, fishy. When I hit the lotto, I will dedicate my life to finding the conclusion for the peace of my family. I was married on the date of Terry's death so that a happy memory could be made on that date. It helps Mom somewhat. Keep the prayers coming for us to know, and thank you." End quote. Terry's mom, Mary, died in 2021, never knowing what happened to her little boy. And so, Mary's children carry the torch forward. They continue to work with others to try to find the killer. As recent as 2017, investigators did say that they hoped advanced DNA testing could come into play. Trooper Roberts said, quote, "We have the ability now to hopefully get some clues or leads that we've never had before," end quote. And so, I'll end with what Chris Bowers, Terry's little brother, shared about what he hopes comes from the case. "If it is God's will, it will be done, and we're just hoping that that's the case. I really hope it's God's will." If you have any information on the murder of Terrence Bowers Jr., please contact the Pennsylvania State Police at 610-486-6280 or Pennsylvania Crime Stoppers at 1-800-4PA-TIPS. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast. New episodes are released every Monday with mini episodes and content on social media in between. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Case suggestions can be sent to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening.